Okay, continuing on with our appendix edition, if you will, of this tutorial. This column here, if you've got no number here actually entered in, here in red, then likely this is the number you need right here. If you're wanting it to charge the same each quarter, which again would apply to those categories where I have this code MB-SEQ in there. So I could go ahead and type that 66667, and of course then it changes that number, and so you would disregard that number from this point going forward. Then here we have the category federal spent, and this just shows you how much has been spent so far. And as you will recognize, and I may have alluded to in a previous tutorial, this information, the amount spent and the amount left, is actually all supplied to us over here in the cumulative budget. Over here, see for my project coordinator, it shows down here how much I've spent in federal. If I scroll that down a little bit, the amount left for project coordinator would be down here in this box. You can see it says there are remaining funds available, but by putting it over here in our invoices, then you just avoid having to kind of go back and forth if you're kind of needing to reference those numbers to assess exactly how much to put in here into your invoice. And so it just kind of brings a lot of that data over here for easy reference right into the same spreadsheet. So it shows you how much you've spent and how much you have left. Again, as I noted earlier, just for example purposes, I've filled out the amount $833.33 for the program manager position in the federal charges for every quarter for 12 quarters, and so now it shows that I've spent $10,000, and it shows that I don't have any left, and so for that particular one. But for one I'm just working on now, see, it's going to show that I've spent this much so far. So I'm currently in the invoice 2, or the second invoice for this project, and so obviously there must be some in quarter 1. If I go over there, I can see that displayed here for project coordinator. There's some entered in there. Again, that's just numbers I put in for demonstration purposes. But going back over to invoice 2, so then it shows the total amount that's been spent so far, including this quarter. So once you enter that number in, it's going to include that here, including this quarter. Of course, if I take that out, then it changes that and shows I've only spent $833 from the first quarter. Alright, I think you get the idea then, perhaps. And so this would apply going down. I haven't done this breakdown for each of the individual travel buckets, but just instead for the total travel. And again, travel, this wouldn't really apply because travel is something that's going to fluctuate each quarter. It would give you a little bit of a frame of reference just as how quickly you're spending your federal and how much you have left, which could become important late in a contract as you gauge, how many more trips, how much more travel are we going to have as part of this contract? Do we need to kind of save a lot for the last quarter, or are we going to have the bulk of it in the middle and so we can spend it on down towards the end? But it just kind of gives you that gauge right here, how much you've spent and how much you have left right here within the same spreadsheet as your invoice. And then we have the same thing for match. Here it's going to show me how much match I've spent and how much match I have left to fill. And of course, if I go over how much I've allotted match that I have to fill, then the number's going to appear in parentheses. So it's showing just based on numbers I've put in perhaps in my first quarter that I've already way over in these categories, which you typically wouldn't exceed that until late in the contract. If you exceed it at all. I mean, hopefully you're at least meeting it, just depending on the details of that contract. But and then here you have this is going to kind of be the recommended amount left. And since I put in some figures, it would seem over here in Invoice 1, there's some pretty large figures sitting there. These figures are, again, as you may recall from previous tutorials, it's drawing these from the timesheet. And they're coming in there, and they're, in this particular example, unusually high. But so those numbers there actually exceed the match designated for this contract already. Again, just the example numbers that I put in, and so they're appearing in parentheses. But if we look at another one that hasn't been filled in yet, we could just let's just say our office space down here. You could see it's recommending, based on the numbers for this contract that we put in initially over here in our cumulative budget spreadsheet, the numbers that are in the contract for the total budget for office space and the total match expected. It's recommending that we have a federal charge of $833.33 here, and it's recommending to us over here, that would be this column, see buckets of match divided by quarters left, it's recommending to me that I have 333 that I put in here. So if I were to go ahead and do that, again, that number is going to change right there. It's going to drop down. And so then that number basically becomes irrelevant. If I jump ahead to my next quarter's invoice, we'll say quarter 3, you can see, get to the right area here, that for our office space, my recommended match is still $333.33. And so on going forward until I enter that number in match in my invoice. Okay. Coming back here to Invoice 2, it's recommending here that I put in my federal amount. Here again, this is, see, my federal category, buckets of federal divided by quarters left, including the current quarter. 833 in here. So I type that in, and of course this number now has changed, and therein becomes irrelevant. So once I've typed that in, and if I go forward to further quarters such as quarter 3, it's still $833 there. So that's kind of built so that you simply enter in the data quarter by quarter. If you kind of jump ahead and enter in data in future quarters the way that I have done with my program manager, then it kind of throws off stuff on this table, and this table won't really be helpful to you in whatever categories or whatever buckets you might call it that you've gone ahead and entered data. And again, with my program manager, I've done that. You can see here all the program manager numbers are filled in for 12 quarters, and so the information here it's not going to be particularly helpful to me at that moment. And it's simply going to show I've spent that much and how much I've left, you know. So here on this little sidebar next to it is the total on the invoice for that category that's been spent so far. So if I need to know the total that I've already plugged in here for all my personnel that I've typed in, then it's going to show it right here. Of course, if I then go change this number, see, then that drops it down right here. If I, for whatever reason, decide, oh, I'm not going to charge that $666 for my admin, and it changes. So that mainly just would be relevant for these categories that have multiple subcategories. You know, your personnel has typically 3 sub personnel categories, sub buckets for your admin, for your other positions such as a program manager and a project coordinator, or sometimes you might call it implementation manager. And so it's simply to give you that total for how much you've actually plugged in so far. And I haven't tabulated all this necessarily for the 4th person, which we're kind of calling personnel other, knowing that's going to be, I think, pretty unusual. You'll have a 4th person. So if you ever actually had a 4th person, you kind of have to weigh how useful this would be to you. But anyway, yeah, so this is showing me total how much I've actually put in my invoice here in the whole personnel category. So that would be useful for the personnel. Here you can see it also for travel. It's giving me the total that I've got in here for travel for federal. Could be useful if I needed to know the total in all of my other category, and so on. If I needed all my contractual, then that's going to show up here in the different contractual categories and so on. Okay. Coming over here to this side where we have match, then it's going to give me the total I've got in match for that particular bucket. Now, if I go over here to invoice 1, we can see that in operation where I've actually got some match filled in. Again, it's for personnel. It's pulling those from my timesheets. I'm going to take a moment here and switch our view. Again, this is page layout view currently, so if I switch that back to normal, that makes that a little easier to view. So it's showing me that my total match that I've filled in for that quarter for the personnel sub buckets. Grand total for personnel, I have a match of $31,109.60. That'd be highly, highly unusual for a single quarter, but that's just the numbers I had thrown in there. Again, based on what's in my timesheet at the moment. So, all right. As we continue discussing this, I'm going to go back over to invoice 2. But before I do, again, I want to just offer a reminder. All this, it's calculating all this based on the number of quarters for that contract. And you're entering that number right here. As you can see, it's in red. That's where it needs to be entered. And so it's using that information of how many quarters you've got in that contract to tabulate all this data, which might be 8, it might be 12. Once in a while you might have a case where it gets extended to some other number. We did have one that got extended beyond 12 quarters, but and so if it gets extended, then some of this data will not be as useful to you. You'd have to at the point of the extension, I guess, go change this number, but then I haven't kind of put all that to the test to see how that would affect things if you get an extension. But presuming that you're not operating under an extension, then this number here needs to be entered in by hand from the contract paperwork based on how many quarters you have for that contract. And then that will tabulate the data for you. So going back to invoice 2, where we're kind of focusing on for this particular demonstration in this tutorial. I've placed over here in this column here, just again the titles for each sub bucket, and it's just drawing that data from over here. And so it's just this title, program manager. As you can see, it's in green. It means the data in that cell is drawing from over here. So whatever's over here, it's drawing from, placing over here, just so you know, if you end up in a view on your screen where perhaps like this, you don't have to keep trying to remember, okay, now what's this line for? What's this line? You can reference over here, okay. And then next to it, we have just a place for explanations. And this is, again, just for internal reference, nothing you're going to be submitting actually in your report. And basically then, this whole line here following the word explanation, where you can see the red lettering, where it says enter in any narrative data needed describing how you came up with the number entered on the invoice. So this would particularly apply to your federal, but it could apply to match too. But basically, if there's any clarity that you feel is needed to explain exactly how you came up with the individual figure, maybe you've got a particular invoice for your internet service, but then you didn't use the actual figure on the internet service for how much you put in federal. You combined several different internet invoices that came in for your internet provider. In our case, it's a company called Windstream. So maybe we put a couple Windstream invoices together, and then we charge 60% of that amount, and you put it right here. And then you would put that explanation over here. And especially this kind of gets involved because let's say you're dividing your Windstream bill between a couple different 319 contracts, and maybe, yeah, you take your 60% of that you're going to put in federal of all your Windstream bills, but then you take that amount of the 60% divided in half between two contracts. Then you would put that explanation over here and type that in there so it becomes clear. And I've just had a number of situations where following submission of an invoice or just at some point in the invoice process after I'd previously entered in a number that I had to go back and revisit exactly how that I came up with that number, and sometimes I just couldn't remember and needed more detailed notes, or a colleague needed that information, or I needed it from a colleague, especially again if EPD was coming back to ask, hey, now how did you come up with this particular number on the invoice? And so that's a place where I can record that information. And I'm learning that some information needs to be written out for EPD so it's clear for them, all throughout all the documentation. But if at any point it's not entirely clear, then you can just write it right here for your own internal reference if you need to go back later and understand exactly how you came up with that number. So I think that's basically everything I was wanting to go over. I trust that's clear.